Thanks very much indeed. Well, don't need to say very much. We're very pleased today to welcome Huw Lloyd from Manchester Metropolitan University, where I think I'm correct in saying he's Senior Lecturer in Wildlife Ecology. Yep. Huw is hot foot from China. He only got back a couple of days ago. I don't think specially for this talk, but we like to think so. And he will bring you right up to date with avian conservation in China. So over to you, Huw.
Thank you, Robert. Well, thanks for everybody for coming. Thanks for inviting me. I've got to say from the outset, I kind of cheat a little bit. As you probably, if you are familiar with species such as red-crowned cranes, you'll know that photograph is not taken in China. There's the resident population in Hokkaido in Japan, and that's where all the good stuff is photographed, really. And a lot of these photographs are not mine. So there's a lot of credit that's got to be given to an awful lot of people online and bird tours, etc., who've put these photographs out there. I've been quite lucky in the last sort of 8 to 9 years in helping to develop bird conservation science in China. It kind of all began in a former life, working for Phil McGowan and Pete Garson from the World Pheasant Association up in Newcastle, where my job was to develop conservation science capacity, particularly related to galliforms, in a number of key institutions across China and India and Brazil, and to help them internationalise their science. And in China in particular, we've had tremendous success over the last sort of 8 to 9 years. There are some remarkable institutions and some remarkable academics and students who are really making some quite powerful insights into bird ecology, phylogenetics, taxonomy, bird conservation, bird biogeography. Started 8 to 9 years ago working with some remarkable undergraduate and postgraduate students from a number of Chinese institutions, including Beijing Forestry University, Beijing Normal University, Peking University, Sichuan University, a number of different institutions. And initially that sort of capacity development started with ecological training techniques, teaching them to standardize their field methods, their approaches to bird surveys, to behavioral studies, and getting them also to international workshops. So as part of the WPA symposium in Chiang Mai in 2010, we hosted subsequent workshops where we were able to fund and send a lot of students from China, the Philippines, India, and other countries to all sort of meet in a larger sort of postgraduate community, an international postgraduate community, where they can learn more up-to-date field techniques in surveying galliforms and other bird species. And things have moved on, particularly in China, since then. Now China is undertaking some incredible research. They have incredible resources at their disposal. What they lack is those opportunities for internationalizing their research. They lack the ability to reach out beyond the geopolitical borders of China and to really sort of start playing in a level playing field when it comes to their science and to publishing their science. Since 2009, I've really been working, well, in the last few years actually, it's kind of, my focus has narrowed down to just a small number of institutions. We've worked very closely with the Institute of Zoology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, and primarily our work is now with Beijing Normal University, which has now become sort of the foremost ornithological research department in the whole of the country. And working with these two institutions over the last 8 to 9 years, we've developed a good strong number of postgrads, and a lot of them have gone on to become postdoctoral students, and a small number of them are now lecturers. So Nan Yu, who I work with at the Institute of Zoology, he's now a lecturer at Beijing Normal University. He's just got a tenure track position this year. Tian Weixia, who's now rapidly developing into one of China's leading sort of avian bioacoustic experts. He's got a lectureship at Beijing Normal University. And one of our greatest sort of successes and real privilege to work with is this guy. This is Dr. Donglai Li, who's a PhD student when I first met him at Beijing Normal University. He's now a lecturer at Liaoning University in China. And our research has now developed into much more of a formal collaboration centred on waterbird communities and understanding the distribution and abundance of waterbird communities, particularly around the Yellow River Delta area in China. Back during his PhD, Donglai started by, it's no mean feat really, when you think about the Yellow River Delta and what the migratory waterbird communities are facing in this region, it's quite startling really. This region has some 650 million people nearby, with a lot of inland gas, oil exploration. That's kind of failing right now, and they're moving kind of more offshore, and there's a massive mosaic of artificial wetlands interspersed by these natural wetlands. And Donglai's research was largely focused on, right, how on earth do these migratory birds actually cope with these incredible anthropogenic natural landscape mosaics? You all know about the East Asian Australasian flyway. This is a key wintering ground and stopover site for some 8 million plus birds, some 50 to 60 different bird species that actually come through this particular region. And so Donglai spent quite a significant period of time in this particular part of the Yellow River Delta National Nature Reserve, looking at the different components of this wetland, this enormous sort of wetland mosaic, trying to fathom what are the particular values of the different components for bird conservation in the region. So to give you an idea of the sorts of species and the numbers of the population sizes of some of the birds that he's been dealing with. This is a list of the conservation priority waterbird species recorded during his fieldwork between 2007 and 2009. So some of the real specialties, some of the real sort of conservation priorities are things like Saunders gull, the red-crowned crane, which I'll come back to in a moment. The Dalmatian pelican is particularly rare at this site. So back then, up until 2010, you can see the percentage of the flyway population that actually utilises the Yellow River Delta National Nature Reserve. Up to 40% Saunders gull, only 12% of the red-crowned crane, even fewer Dalmatian, similar sort of numbers for the Dalmatian pelicans. Again, very small percentage, maximum percentage of the flyway population actually of these conservation priority species use that reserve. But throughout the Yellow River Delta, you'll get sort of similar numbers at localised sites. And these are just the conservation priority species. There are, as I said, some 8 million other individual birds across, another 40 or so plus species that utilise this area. And some really interesting patterns emerge when you look at the wetland landscape in terms of the mosaic of the different types of wetland habitats that you have. Now, this kind of looks a bit of a mystery when you first look at it. This is just simply a type of ordination to show you how similar and dissimilar the waterbird communities are across the different sort of wetland habitats in this massive landscape. And put simply, in terms of data analysis, what you do is you identify the primary sort of environmental gradients that influence the distribution and abundance of birds, and then you kind of overlay the abundance and distribution data of the birds on top of those environmental gradients. And simply the different symbols constitute what the bird communities look like in natural, artificial, and newly restored wetlands across the Yellow River Delta National Nature Reserve. And some quite simple patterns emerge. The two triangles correspond to the two larger areas of natural wetlands. They are very, very similar to each other, and there is some overlap between the natural wetlands and some of the artificial wetland habitats. The restored wetlands, one of the restored wetlands is very, very similar to another type of artificial wetland habitat, whereas one of the other newly restored wetland habitats is largely unique in terms of its waterbird community. So what you get is some overlap between the natural elements and some of the artificial, some of the restored and one of the artificial, but also one of the restored wetlands has a very different bird community composition compared to the other landscape elements. So you get our first insight into the distribution and abundance of the waterbird communities, the migratory species that are coming in and how they can utilise these different wetland components. You can also do some very simple ordination techniques to look at the migration chronologies as well, and you get a very sort of predictable pattern. These symbols simply represent what the bird communities look like at certain times of the year. And in the first half of the year, kind of the black symbols, way over in January and February, that's what the bird communities look like. And then as the year progresses, the bird community looks like this, and looks like this, and looks like this, till you get to about June, and that's what the bird community looks like. Then as the migrant species return from the south to the north, then the bird communities sort of fall back on themselves, and you get a very, very similar pattern of bird species richness and bird abundance. So it's a fairly predictable pattern. So we kind of know how they're distributed and what they look like, and the woodbird community looks like in the different wetland components, and we get a really sort of nice, fairly predictable pattern of their migration chronologies in the Yellow River Delta. But this region is absolutely chocker full of artificial wetlands. Aquaculture ponds, brine shrimp ponds, salt pans. There's a massive reservoir, Gubai Reservoir. There are irrigation canals and rice fields, all interdispersed amongst these natural wetland components. And there's a growing body of literature to show that many waterbird species around the world actually utilise these secondary artificial wetland habitats. There's a growing body of literature, particularly from California, that these actually might represent a nice, cheap, easy option for waterbird conservation in many parts of the world. And it may be the case that some of the conservation priority bird species, or some of the migratory species at least, are actually able to utilise these large areas of artificial wetlands. And the next step for Don Liley's research was actually to try and tackle that question. How many bird species are restricted to the different types of artificial wetlands, or are they more restricted to the natural wetland components? And that can really inform a lot of conservation decisions to be made in this massive sort of wetland landscape complex, where an awful lot of people depend economically on these artificial wetlands. But again, very simple. This is not real complicated science. This is just straightforward field surveys, broken up by guilds or families of birds. Don Liley compared the natural wetlands, looking at the numbers of species and the maximum abundance of these species or guilds, and compared that with the reservoirs, the salt pans, the irrigation canals, the rice fields, and the aquaculture ponds. And large numbers of birds are recorded. If you look at the natural wetlands, just under 50,000 individual birds have been utilising the natural wetlands there. Much smaller numbers of birds utilising all the other artificial wetlands. But nevertheless, 3,500 species using the Gubai Reservoir, 3,500 individuals, almost 6,500 individual birds using aquaculture ponds. So it seems that they are playing some role in supporting some species of birds, some guilds of birds, across this wetland mosaic. But by far, what appears to be the most important element in this landscape are the natural wetlands. So despite all the calls across wetland bird conservation expertise across the world about the importance of artificial wetlands, it appears here, at least when you look at this table, that natural wetlands are certainly the much more important component in the landscape. And you can delve a little deeper into these sorts of data and look at, okay, the numbers of species that are exclusive to these different types of wetland components. This is probably a much more important measure. And probably if you look at this graph, you can see that the natural wetlands have by far the greatest proportion of exclusive species that are found in no other component of the wetland landscape. Paddy fields rice fields still have a large number of exclusive species, as do the salt pans. But nothing kind of can compete with the natural wetlands. They have by far the greater number of exclusive species, the greatest number of species that are restricted to them, and also conservation priority bird species. They do share an awful lot of other bird species with the other artificial wetlands. So there's definitely an important secondary conservation function for these artificial wetlands. But when it comes to managing these massive, massive wetland landscape mosaics, you cannot compromise on natural wetlands. You cannot say, well, we can kind of chop some of them up and still have, a lot of birds in more rice fields or in more salt pans or aquaculture ponds. You cannot compromise on natural wetlands, and within that landscape, these data and the data from the previous book shows that these are the focus of conservation efforts, that these are actually the source populations for everything else within the landscape. So we cannot lose focus from natural wetlands onto the artificial wetlands, but they are important and they can support other unique species that adds or increases the overall diversity of water birds in this landscape. In amongst those water bird communities, it's probably what I would argue one of the most iconic bird species in China, and that's Grus japoanensis, the red-crowned crane. This is culturally woven into Chinese history, Chinese culture, and it's been there for thousands and thousands of years, and also in countries like Korea and also Japan. This is the best crane, really, in my opinion. 15 species of crane. This is the best one. It's one of the tallest. It's got the kind of reverse black-white plumage colorations on the wing. It's got the most elaborate dance. It stands taller during the courtship display. It raises its wings higher than the other cranes. It tips its neck back at a slightly sharper degree and angle than all the other cranes. The crown gets really sort of blood red and contrasts much more greatly with the other colorations, particularly during the breeding season with the males according with the females. It is a spectacular, spectacular species of crane. And anybody read Peter Mathiassen's The Birds of Heaven, Travels with Crane? It's a fantastic, fantastic book with a chapter. Each chapter is devoted to a particular species of crane, and it's largely to do with the resident population in Japan, but nevertheless it's a fantastic read, and he paints a real clear picture of how important, how culturally ingrained this bird species is to the people of China, to the people of Korea and Japan. And one of the most famous quotes in the book comes from Japan after the Second World War, and Peter Mathiassen writes, after the Second World War, a young girl named Sadako Sasaki folded 645 paper cranes before she died of cancer caused by radiation from the first atom bomb. The status depicting her with a crane origami stands in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park. And the quote, which is widely spoken of in Japan and other countries, widely attributed to Sadako's father. The snow falls in the far field where travellers spent the night. I ask you, crane, to warm my child under your wings. Wherever you go in China, there are cranes depicted everywhere. This is a picture from last week at the Summer Palace, just on the outskirts of Beijing, and there are monuments, depictions of cranes everywhere. This is kind of a weird fusion of black-necked crane and red-crowned crane. I think it's supposed to be red-crowned crane, but it's there in some of the gardens of the Summer Palace. When you climb up towards the top of the Summer Palace, you'll get to see one of the many sort of throne rooms. I think this is Ming Dynasty, and the emperor during the Ming Dynasty wanted to... the belief was that if you had a red-crowned crane standing guard at the edge of your throne. It would add 5,000 years to your life, but he wanted to live 10,000 years extra, so he added 2, one either side of the throne. And wherever you go, you will see depictions and bronze statues of cranes, paintings throughout various palaces, the Forbidden City. Even the wooden beams in places like the Summer Palace are adorned with black-neck cranes, red-crown cranes, or a fusion between the two. And most of these are actually largely overlooked by 99% of the tourists who are kind of looking elsewhere. And if you look up at the wooden beams, you get these incredible integrated sort of paintings of cranes and other bird species. The point is that this red crown crane is really, really important to the people of China. It's really important to the people of Korea and also Japan. And it was popular during various dynasties in Chinese history. It's really popular now. And the red crown crane population that winters in the Yellow River Delta are attracting an awful lot of tourists. China has this incredible, massive internal bird wildlife tourism market. I've worked in the bird tourism industry for a number of years in another form of life, and we never saw it on an international stage. World birders, groups of Chinese photographers or groups of Chinese birders coming to different countries. But within China itself, it's a massive, massive market. And a lot of them go to the Yellow River Delta to photograph the wintering crane population, and also to see the red carpet, which I'll talk about in a minute. And one of the things that Dong Lai Li has been looking at is the impact of this increasing number of tourists on the behaviour of the red-crowned cranes. It's a big concern for the Chinese government. And what we find is that there's a real sort of change in vigilance behaviour and foraging behaviour of the red-crowned cranes. And that the further the tourists are away from the cranes, the better it is for them. But it's habitat dependent. So when they're foraging in the so-called red carpet, in this pure stands of Sueda salsa habitat, the cranes have got quite a level viewing field with which they can assess risk. But when it comes to the taller vegetation, the Sueda salsa phragmites australis mosaic, then there's a real problem. And there seems to be a very sharp and very distinct 300-metre threshold. As soon as the tourists get within 300 metres of the red-crowned cranes, they start feeding. They get very nervous, very flighty, they're incredibly vigilant, and they're spending more time alert, vigilant and fleeing than foraging. And that's habitat dependent. So this 300-metre threshold, when all the tourists start walking towards them, that triggers a high degree of vigilance, and that represents a form of disturbance to the cranes. That's not a good thing for such a massive, massive bird, and for such an iconic bird, and something that the Chinese government is very, very wary of. So there needs to be some form of better control, better information given to tourists, so they can kind of respect the boundaries between foraging cranes, wintering cranes, which have to replenish their energy sources, and the requirements of the tourism and generating income from this massive internal tourism market. Now, most of the red-crowned cranes in the world are migratory. There is the resident population down here in Japan, but this is the only study of migratory cranes that have tagged them. And this is 20 years old, so this is by a collaboration between Japanese, Korean and Russian and Chinese scientists. Hugachi is the lead author, from 1998. They managed to tag a small number of red-crowned cranes from Kingansky. Forgive my pronunciation, I don't know anything about the Russian language, but I think it's Kingansky Nature Reserve and the Kanka Lake. And there are basically two, from what we know, there are two migratory routes, or two migratory populations within the global red-crowned crane population. One of them migrates through China and winters down in the Laohui and Bohai Bay Yellow River Delta. Some of them progress further down south to the Yangcheng National Nature Reserve. And the other population They take a shorter time, use fewer stopover sites, spend less at each stopover site. They actually winter down here, right smack bang in the middle of the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Good luck trying to get a research visa to study that population. So there's not much we can do about that one, but we can look in great detail at this migratory population. They winter here. Particularly around the Yellow River Delta, we know there are about 500 or so red-crowned cranes that winter around here, and approximately another 500 around Yancheng. Those numbers have been relatively stable over the last few years. There have been slight decreases, but they're relatively stable. Perhaps more remarkably is what we found, or rather Dong Lai Li and his team have found, what sustains this wintering population. And it appears that the red-crowned cranes that stop in the Yellow River Delta, particularly at the Yellow River Delta National Nature Reserve, are entirely dependent on tidal mudflat crabs as their primary food resource. Most other studies of cranes will show you that they're dependent on fish and vegetation and plant matter to a certain degree. And if you look at the resident population in Hokkaido, they eat all sorts of vegetation. It's largely because they've been habituated by all the supplementary feeding that the farmers have been doing in Japan. And that's a very, very misleading figure. So what Dong Lai Li has done, incredibly, he's gone out into the wetlands and actually collected as much poop as possible. Over 100 samples, over 100 fecal pellets from feeding red-crowned cranes, and has painstakingly dissected the whole lot and found an incredibly high proportion of mudflat crab remains in them. You get these are the walking tips of the legs, and these are the two parts of the claws, the dactyl and the pollex of the main claw. And walking around, you'll find remains of mudflat crabs where the red-crowned cranes have actually dug into their burrows. And if you track this over time, autumn, when the cranes arrive, they eat an awful lot of crabs, they eat an awful lot of plant material, but very small amounts of fish, very small amounts of non-food materials which are unidentifiable. We think these are now seeds. We think that red-crowned cranes are probably seed dispersers as well. But that's another story. Then, as they progress through winter, they eat even more crabs, less vegetation, a little bit more fish, and then it really booms in springtime, where some of the hibernating crabs actually emerge from their burrows and the red-crowned cranes really gorge themselves. And you can see the amounts of the remains of claws and the tips of walking legs increases from autumn through winter into spring. So these things are absolutely gorging themselves on tidal mudflat crabs. And probably what's even more remarkable is that they seem to have a particular preference for females. In terms of the diet, the ratio of females to males in the diet is 5 to 1. The females of female crabs to male crabs in the wild is 1 to 2. There are twice as many males than females in the wild population. Yet they are disproportionately taking 5 times as many females than males out of the mud. And that's probably because the females are bigger, and particularly from the winter into the spring, they're just packed full of eggs. Rich energy supply for a bird that needs to build up its resources, a massive bird that needs to build up its resources, ready for its northward migration back to its breeding site. So they're entirely dependent on mudflat crabs. And if you're going to conserve the wintering population during the non-breeding season of migratory red-crowned cranes, you're going to have to look after and conserve mudflat crab habitat. And perhaps more remarkably, and this is hot off the press from last week at Beijing Normal University, a separate research group at the School of the Environment has been looking at the role of mudflat crabs within the wider ecosystem. This is a shot of the Yellow River Delta Natural Nature Reserve, and all these are crab burrows, interspersed with seedlings of the Sueda salsa plants, with much more mature plants in the background. And this behaviour, this burrowing activity, creates a very unique microtopography, what they call a concave convex microtopography. And that topography, that sort of moonscape, that muddy moonscape, basically creates rather unique conditions that influences the native plant communities along that mudflat. The burrowing activity of the crabs basically acts as a natural seed trap for the native swada plants as they move in and out with the water. These mudflat crabs, these burrows, and these raised, mashed up bits of mud will actually capture those floating seeds, and they'll settle and they'll germinate in those pockets where the burrows are. That leads to established clusters of plants, and when they mature, you have a greater success of further establishment. You'll have much more seeding events going on. Not only that, the cranes are doing it too, by digging up the mudflat crabs, pulling them out of their burrows and creating some muddy disturbances. They're basically replicating this concave, convex microtopography of the crab burrows, and those act also to facilitate further seed traps, or the trapping of seeds, the Swada seeds, further facilitating the establishment of the Swada salsa plants. Even more remarkable is Professor Huw Lloyd, who's conducted a lot of this research. They've done all sorts of fantastic enclosure experiments to show that the mudflat crabs in certain ditches, anthropogenic ditches that are carved out in the mudflat crabs, in the tidal mudflats, the mudflat crabs will actually eat the seeds of one of the biggest problems that they have in the Yellow River Delta, which is the invasive Spartina alterniflora swordgrass, which is causing all sorts of damaging effects to the natural succession of plants. So not only are the crabs acting, the crab burrows acting as seed traps for the native plants, but they're actually occasionally gorging themselves on the seeds of the invasive Spartina alterniflora. So, as this, I don't have permission to show the data because this is straight off hot press from last week in China, but one of the talks that were presented to us sums it up nicely, really. The native herbivores, the tidal mudflat crabs, enhance the resistance of an anthropogenically disturbed salt marsh to Spartina alterniflora invasion. They basically eat the seeds to prevent the establishment of this invasive plant. And that particularly happens in areas of high anthropogenic disturbance. And I just think that that's absolutely remarkable, that we know that these crabs are the primary food resource for the cranes, but they are acting as if they are ecological engineers, as are the cranes, in terms of creating the necessary microtopography to re-establish the red carpet, the Swada salsa red carpet. And this is one of the driving forces of the huge influx of wildlife tourism in the Yellow River Delta area. This is kind of like the Yellow River Delta version of the Northern Lights. Everybody wants to come here to see the red carpet, and the Chinese government will do anything to preserve that scene. That's their Machu Picchu, that's their Egyptian pyramids, that's the shot that earns them an awful lot of money through tourism income. Now they have an evidence base to preserve crab habitat, to preserve the crab population, to preserve the red-crowned crane population, and you can see the different ecological layers all coming together, that ecosystem approach that's required to preserve this fantastic scene. The take-home lesson is that crabs are really important. You're going to conserve the crabs, if you can conserve the habitat, so you can conserve the Swada salsa, conserve the crane population, you've got to conserve the crabs. They're really, really important. They're really bad for a small subpopulation of this guy. This is the reed parrotbill. And there are a number of small populations of this species throughout the Yellow River Delta. There's two in particular of interest. There's one kind of in the inland bit of the mouth of the delta, in sort of inland reedy habitat, and there's a smaller population right on the tip of the coast, where the delta kind of meets the coast. And it's that subpopulation which is of interest, because it appears, it doesn't appear, what's actually happening is the tidal mudflat crabs are eating and predating every single nest that they can find of the reed parrot. These are herbivores. So the crabs, what the crabs are actually doing is climbing up into the Phragmites reed habitat and gorging themselves on fresh foliage. And whilst they're up there, they're finding the nests. And once they're in the nests, they're just devastating the eggs. And Dong Lai Li has photographed crabs in the nest, he's photographed crab-damaged eggs, poop, more poop, in the reed parrotbill nests. And in that one subpopulation, there is 100% nest failure. Elsewhere, you can get up to 68% of nest failure caused directly by mudflat crab predation. And in that outer tidal reed bed habitat, there seems to be an incredibly high density of tidal mudflat crabs. We're not entirely sure why that is. Dong Lai suspects that it's something to do with the way that the reed bed is harvested using a particular mechanical technique that's causing this abnormally high density of tidal mudflat crabs. But what we have is an ecological trap, in that the reed parrotbills are still nesting there. And that there's this mismatch between the cues that they use to identify suitable breeding habitat and the features that influence breeding success. They've basically got an ecological trap scenario. There's this incongruence between nest site selection and low nest survival. And this has to be a recent phenomenon, otherwise the whole population will become extinct. So it's a remarkable, remarkable situation for one of the smaller subpopulations of this nationally threatened species in China. China and Beijing Normal University in particular are making massive inroads in terms of developing their expertise in bioacoustic monitoring. And 8-9 years ago, I had the privilege of working with Professor Yanyun Zhang and some of his master's students monitoring, developing acoustic monitoring techniques for species such as yellow-bellied tit. And over the last 11 years, Professor Yan Yun and one of his students, Chen Wei-Xie, have been working with the brownish flanked bush warbler, which is one of those nondescript BBJs. And in China, it's buried in really dense, scrubby habitat. That thing is not going to come out at all. You're not going to see it. It's buried. So surveying these things, these secretive species, is a very difficult thing to do. But Professor Yan Yun and Chen Wei-Xie found that population in Dongsai National Nature Reserve, the males are individually recognizable by their song. They're vocally individual. So you can create all sorts of new monitoring techniques for monitoring that population, because that thing isn't going to come out of that bush at all. It'll drive you absolutely insane. But we've looked at small populations, we've looked at large population sizes, and we're getting good classification rate, up to 98% or more in terms of our ability to identify individual males just by their song. But more recently, in the last 3 years, we've been messing around with cuckoos, just because. And a lot of research has come out in the last couple of years about how males have unique vocal characteristics which could be used as a form of individual identification. You all know the cuckoo song. It's got 2 elements in each syllable, the cuckoo, cuckoo. And there are certain structural characteristics within each syllable that you can look at to determine the degree of individuality. They're also fairly consistent in the number of bouts that the number of syllables that they sing in each bout. And what Chen Wei and Professor Yan Yun have looked at is a rather funky population of this thing in Laohi Bay, so just north of Bohai Bay in the Yellow River Delta. And it's unusual because basically in a 40 square kilometre area you'll have about 200 or so individual cuckoos, and they all hang around together. You can see them on electricity wires and telegraph poles. You never see individual cuckoos, you always see gangs of them. Smallest number is like 2 or 3 together, and it could be males and females. So maybe we just don't know that much about cuckoo populations elsewhere in the world, but to me that's really, really unusual. But we've kind of tried to repeat other people's research to see whether we get the same sort of situation in China as you do in other countries. And as a breakdown, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but these are the ku syllables, and you break this down into different structural elements and measure those things, and then you look for variation in these different structural components, and you compare the same syllables in the same males with different males to see if you get bigger inter-individual differences compared to intra-individual differences. We've used two different analytical techniques, and we get a very high correct rate to distinguish individuals. Over 90% of all calls we're able to get down to individual males. And you can get an accurate estimate of male numbers using a broad threshold interval that we've identified. Quite confidently, you can get over 90% of males correctly identified. Using a different technique, DFA, discriminant function analysis, it's slightly higher. So we're suggesting that in this population, at least in China, you can identify individual males. You can use it as an effective tool for surveying the population. If they come back to the same area, you just record, look at the spectrograms, and you'll know which males that you're dealing with. Because you know how really difficult it is to catch cuckoos. In this country, it is anyway. It's a nightmare. However, if that's going to be successful, a successful monitoring technique, those individual call characteristics have got to be stable over time. They've got to be repeatable. You've got to be able to detect that within the same season and across different seasons. So whereas the previous study, led by Chang Wei Xie, we just looked at a 7-day period in the breeding season, we've actually done it now over a 19-day period in the breeding season, using slightly different forms of analysis, recording large numbers of syllables and a large number of males. 6, Chang Wei and his colleagues were actually able to band, so we actually knew the identity of 6 of the males. And there were quite noticeable declines. When you just use same-day recordings over a very short period of time, which is what other previous studies have done in Europe, you get very high classification rates of individuals, up to 94%. But these drop off a cliff to about 40% or even 27% when you use recordings across the whole 19-day period. So it seems that even within the same season, just when we were very confident we had this fantastic new monitoring tool, that actually you lose that vocal individuality over longer time periods, i.e. those characteristics are not stable. And the core consistency disappears also. There's all sorts of papers based on just 2 or 3 days sampling in Europe, which looks at the number of syllables and the repeatability of that from different individual males. That seems to be quite stable over 2 or 3 days, which is kind of what we've found, particularly from the same day. But when you incorporate recordings across the 19-day period, you lose that repeatability. It just goes. So we seem to be losing our vocal individuality, or we're losing our repeatability. It looks as if they're not stable over time. It looks as if we can't actually use this for monitoring. We don't really know what's going on. It could be that you don't actually get a decrease in vocal individuality, in that you just get males, different males, which are largely more or less consistent in their repeatability and in their vocal individuality. They're just not consistent in the number of syllables and the repeatability in the song banks. They're less consistent in those features. But we're working on this. And then there's the females. Nick Davis' study that came out last year, and it's quite a landmark study that some fantastic playback experiments that showed that the female calls, this chuckle-like call that it has, mimics that of a sparrowhawk, and it's used to distract the host's attention away from the nest, so that the females are able to sort of parasitize the nest. It's quite a clever study that Nick Davis and colleagues have done. So we've looked at this. We've looked at intravariation in female cuckoos and compared those with males, looking at temporal patterns and call consistency, and particularly looking at the patterns across the Eurasian common cuckoos geographical distribution, using new field recordings from China and downloading a whole bunch from Zeno Canto. This is the female chuckle call. It's this series of chuckling-like syllables. Each of them is a syllable. Each of these is a syllable. The first really sort of interesting finding from this latest research is that females tend to sing predominantly in the morning along with males. Now that shouldn't happen. If the function of the female call is to mimic sparrowhawks, to distract the host nest's attention, you should get a peak of female vocal activity in the afternoon, because that's when egg laying for things like oriental reed warbler and other nesters, that's where the peak egg laying and incubation period is during the day. So you'd think that the females should be singing their hearts out or chuckling their hearts out in the afternoon in order to distract us as many hosts as possible. But they're not doing it. They're actually singing in the morning, just like the males. So we suspect that the females are actually calling because it has other functions besides distracting the nest host's attention. And perhaps more importantly, that there's absolutely no trend at all with differences in female vocalizations with geographical distance across its whole geographical range. And that's probably because there's all sorts of differences amongst the different subpopulations, differences in call characteristics in the different subspecies, different populations, in different habitats. We know that influences cuckoo calls to a degree. And there's also all sorts of different hawk species with different calls anyway. We don't know anything about sparrowhawk, variation in sparrowhawk vocalizations across the same sort of geographical region. So there's this whole sort of minefield complexity in geographical variation in female calls, and that could basically mask any sort of obvious trend in calls and geographical distances. If you look at latitude, you get a nice sort of significant negative decline, and that's because bird size decreases with latitude, and that's going to influence the quality and type of vocal characteristics anyway. But that's the interesting finding. We're now have put together another manuscript. Chen Wei has led another manuscript that's actually going to try and find out what the actual function of the female call is within this study population in China. So there's expertise in bioacoustics developing quite rapidly in China. There's expertise in water bird conservation. I could do another 20 lectures on their expertise in reintroduction biology, on their expertise in looking at the impacts of climate change on some of their endemic bird species, but we simply don't have time. And to give you an idea of where Chinese ornithological science is heading, this is last year's China Ornithological Society Congress. It's been going for 28 years. They have one every 2 years, so this was the 14th Ornithological Congress that they had. And this was the first time that they've really invited international bird conservation academics invited to give talks and also to host symposia and to host sort of training sessions for them. Over 500-600 or so delegates at this conference with all sorts of fantastic research presented via posters or via presentations, hosted by Shanxi Normal University in Xi'an, the city of Xi'an, where the Terracotta Army are. And this was a real sort of step change in ornithological bird conservation science in China. It was run by the China Ornithological Society. This is kind of the top table. Professor Guangmei Zhang, who is the godfather of ornithological science in China, and Professor Yanyun Zhang, the bioacoustic expert. This was a real statement as to where China wants to go with the quality and the standard of its ornithological science, and how to reach out to the international bird conservation community to say, look, this is what we're doing, please, let's collaborate, let's network, and let's start sharing knowledge on our different research expertise, and also to reach out to help and train young Chinese ornithological students. Some fantastic research on displays, and bear in mind these are MSc students and PhD students, and in many cases writing and presenting their research in English for the very, very first time. All sorts of fantastic studies on endemic galliforms. There's an awful lot of migration tracking studies going on. This is one on little terns. There are master's students jumping on crane species and great knots and black-tailed godwits, sticking tracking devices on them and monitoring where they're going during parts of the East Asian Australasian migratory flyway. All sorts of stuff on bar-headed geese and even Taiwan. A huge influence of research, influx of research from Taiwan. Taiwanese ornithologists liaising and networking with mainland Chinese ornithological expertise. It's a fantastic thing to see. And the remarkable thing is the emphasis on students, masters, even undergrads, but predominantly masters, PhD students and postdoctoral students. I was a little embarrassed because they asked me to be one of the 3 judges on the poster competition. And some of the China Ornithological Society Committee asked me, how we judge these sorts of things in Europe or in the UK, and what sort of awards and prizes do you have for the student who comes first or second, etc. And we sometimes give out book tokens or membership or if you're lucky an iPad, something like that for the students. And the look of shock from some of the committee, because the students who won the poster competition, for example, the students who came in first and second, got an all-expenses-paid trip to the IOC conference in Vancouver, Canada this year. So the hotel, the flight, the food, the visa, absolutely everything. And that's the statement that China is making. They're investing heavily in their postgraduate students and some of their undergraduates as well. They want to create world leaders in bird conservation science, and this is one of the starting points, one of the many starting points that they're making within the country. I was quite honoured really to be given the task of hosting 2 symposia on ornithological research, where the students for the first time had to present their research in English. They'd never done this before, and it never happened in the China Ornithological Congress before. But it was a remarkable thing for these students to do, and you all know the differences between the Mandarin language and English. It's an enormous divide, and that's partly what's holding China back. I've got to choose my words carefully. It's not holding them back, but those language difficulties, to overcome those language difficulties is a major barrier to them in terms of publishing the results and presenting their data at conferences. And that's part of the reason I work in China, is to try and overcome those differences. I always tell my students in Manchester about these students, because in order to get their PhD, they have to publish at least 1 paper in English. And so whenever I hear my students, and I hope you get this on camera, whenever I hear my students moan and complain about the problems that they're experiencing in their PhDs, etc., I remind them, or try and remind them, you can imagine what it would be like to write one of their chapters in Mandarin Chinese. That's the enormity of the challenge that a lot of these postgraduates face, and a lot of them actually overcome. These are quite simply some of the most remarkable students around, and we're spending an awful lot of time, rightfully so, in order to develop, internationalise their science, to get them to publish, to experience publishing in a different language, so they're able to communicate their science to the wider international bird conservation community. And China's making massive inroads in terms of its own ornithological literature. Many, many years ago, 20 or so years ago, there was just Chinese language bird club journals. Very rapidly, about 8 years or so ago, that evolved into Chinese Birds, the International Journal of Ornithology, in predominantly English language. And in the last 3 years, that's evolved even faster into the open access journal Avian Research, which is run predominantly by Beijing Forestry University and the China Ornithological Society. It's now open access on Biomed Central, and in 3 years it's gone from absolute 0 to 1.1 impact factor. And this is truly open access. You don't pay a thing for this. Every other open access journal you could probably name, you still have to pay publication costs. Not in China. And they are very interested in reaching out to all sorts of countries to encourage particularly postgraduate students and postdoctoral students to publish their research in the Avian Research Open Access Journal. So they're making massive progress in terms of the quality of science that they're able to produce, waterbird conservation, bioacoustics, all sorts of other things. They're making massive investments in terms of creating the next generation of conservation science leaders for ornithology in China, and they're really developing their own international journals for ornithological science. So some quite remarkable things happening in China. I'm just grateful to just play a part in that. Thank you very much.